The Supreme Court yesterday heard a direct challenge to Roe v. Wade. Yesterday, during oral arguments, Justice Brett Kavanaugh pondered sending the issue to the states entirely, saying, quote, "Why should this court be the arbiter rather than Congress, the state legislatures, state Supreme Courts, the people being able to resolve this?" While Chief Justice John Roberts indicated interest in scrapping the viability line, but not explicitly overruling Supreme Court precedent and handing it over to the states, he asked, "If you think that the issue is one of choice, viability, it seems to me, doesn't have anything to do with choice. If it really is an issue about choice, why is 15 weeks not enough time?"
Team Rising is here to weigh in. Olayemi Olurin is a public defender at the Legal Aid Society and a political commentator. And Emily Jashinsky is the culture editor at The Federalist. Glad to have you both with us.
Thank you.
Good to be here.
So, Olayemi, what did you make of the arguments yesterday? How do you think this court is leaning?
I think the court seems poised to overturn almost 50 years of precedent. And this is judicial activism at its worst, because there's no need for them to be addressing the overall constitutionality of abortion. Mississippi asked the court to uphold their 15-week ban, which that was the issue that was raised in cert. And that law is clearly unconstitutional based on law as it is and has been, which is that states can't ban abortion prior to viability, which is roughly 24 weeks. And here they are, these conservative justices, half of whom haven't been on the court more than 5 years, poised to reverse law that have been analyzed and upheld by justices before them simply because they can and they want to. And this decision, opens the court up to a delegitimization, which is what Sotomayor fears. That not only does it incentivize these different states to continue passing these laws in bad faith for the purposes of challenging the constitutionality of it, but it delegitimizes the court because it'll make them look like politicians and not jurists. Moreover, it's not a reflection of a major shift in our consciousness in American society. According to the Pew Research Center, most Americans do support abortion in at least some circumstances, making this vastly different than Plessy versus Ferguson. When we overturned Plessy, it was not only because we'd grown as a country and understood the horrors of Jim Crow and how this had affected a population, but that separate but equal was not realized and could not be realized. So in a unanimous decision, we overturned that. That's not the case here. This isn't based on a changed reality in America. No one has been harmed by the decision in Roe that arguably wouldn't have been harmed in 1973. Abortion became legal. It was realized, and most Americans continue to support that right. So there's no larger reason to take up the issue other than judicial activism. And judges sometimes have to do things that they don't like because people rely on precedent. They rely on having rights they've had for decades, and taking away rights and giving new rights are two vastly different things. And taking away rights people already had takes us backwards in time to a time we deliberately departed from.
And Emily, that is an interesting point in the sense that nothing really has changed, and that's the point that Sotomayor made, except for the makeup of the Supreme Court, that there are now more Republican justices than there were before. So, what is the effect on the Supreme Court if the result is all you have to do is just, elect enough justices and the interpretation of the Constitution changes?
Well, I would say the question of viability has changed over the last half century. I think technology has changed our understanding of viability and has actually changed the sort of medical concept of viability, and is continuing to do so. But I think that is a fair question, and I think it's one that the justices does seem to be in mind. The question, though, of Roe v. Wade, like Brett Kavanaugh's line of questioning that we just talked about, it actually sounds a lot like Ruth Bader Ginsburg's critique of the original Roe decision as delegitimizing, in a sense that you have 9 justices taking up this question when it could be that's a question that could be legislated, and in fact probably should be legislated. And that's the thing with this decision. We have a lot of states that are actually preparing individually, either in the pro-abortion side or the anti-abortion side, to deal with what it would look like if the federal Roe v. Wade right to abortion that was created in Roe v. Wade, it's not in the Constitution, from my perspective at least, and we're sort of preparing for it. So to the question of precedent and taking away rights that have existed for a long time, I think we're seeing the process play out. I don't think it's as apocalyptic. I'm not a pro-abortion person, but I don't think it's as apocalyptic as people are saying from that perspective. But I would just add, finally, the Sotomayor line about delegitimizing the court is so interesting because, again, you can talk to liberal legal scholars, Lawrence Tribe, again, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, you can go down the list. And a lot of people say that's actually what the original Roe decision did. And that's why it's vulnerable here. It's why it was vulnerable in Casey, and it's why it's vulnerable again in Dobbs, because it just was not a well-written decision that was in line with the Constitution as it's mostly interpreted. And I think that's what's being reckoned with right now.
And so here's that exact quote, so everyone has it, from Justice Sotomayor. She asked, quote, "Will this institution survive the stench that this creates in the public perception that the Constitution and its reading are just political acts?" Which, I mean, I think I agree with Emily's point that, I mean, and also in a weird way, like the Supreme Court took this issue under the initial Roe v. Wade decision, took this issue out of the hands of democratically elected forces. And for all this, rah-rah democracy, everything has to be decided on a democratic basis. The right is eroding democracy, et cetera. Well, this was an example where progressives or liberals, people who are pro-choice, wanted to take this issue out of the hands of local democratic authorities. How would you respond to that, Alaimi?
Well, I'd say whether or not you don't like this decision or you think it was arbitrary in terms of the actual language used in it in 1973, it has been the law for almost 50 years. It's been the law and people mostly support it. So what we always have to remember is that making abortion illegal does not stop abortion from happening. What will stop are safe abortions, equal access to abortions. People will be exposed to that danger, to these back alley abortions. And we have to remember that that's the world that we lived in prior to Roe. These decisions don't happen in a vacuum. They happen because women were taking these risks to have these abortions. Women were dying, and that's not hyperbole. We ban abortions, people do die. So I look to the fact that this has been reality, not how we would have felt about it 50 years ago, but the fact that there are people currently existing relying on it.
Let me just say, I agree with that. I think that's absolutely true. If we ban abortions, women will die. It's going to happen. If that happens, we will see back alleys. We will see the return of that. There's no question. But from my perspective as somebody who's anti-abortion, who's pro-life, the balance, the sort of cost benefit there is still firmly in the favor of overturning Roe.
So Amy Coney Barrett is one of these new justices that Alaimi was talking about. She had a kind of what I would consider bizarre argument yesterday, but I'd like to get your take on it. She said, since you can give up a child for adoption, therefore the only interest that a person has is in terminating the pregnancy, and therefore that's not actually a burden. Like she talked about that just as it's just a minor little medical inconvenience or something that a woman would have to undergo for 40 weeks and then it's over. And so what's the big fuss here? Does that have currency among kind of the movement that she sprung from, that reasoning?
No, actually, I was just saying, I mean, obviously it's part of the argument, and you have people from like crisis pregnancy centers and there are pro-life activists who will help facilitate adoptions. But I would say that's why I think reading too much into the questioning during these oral arguments can sometimes be a really dangerous game, because often what they're doing is floating hypotheticals to see how the lawyers respond, and to kind of poke holes in their case from the devil's advocate perspective, or even from supportive perspectives. We saw that yesterday with Justice Alito. So when we start reading too much into this and say Amy Coney Barrett opposes this because she will have this adoption opinion, it's interesting to get the insight into their thinking, but I don't know if that's totally representative of her opposition, if that exists, to Roe.
Yeah. Alaimi, we'll get real quick. We can give you the last word, and then we got to go.
Okay. Well, I'd say I can't speak to a sincerity, but I can say that the opinion is completely devoid from reality. It fails to acknowledge the fact that pregnancy itself can be what's life-changing. It's the pregnancy itself that can threaten your life. It's the pregnancy itself where you receive some kind of social stigma, where you're ostracized from your family. It's the pregnancy itself where you can get depression. It's the pregnancy itself where you could lose your job. And that's something we have to take into consideration. The trials and tribulations that comes with being forced to carry a pregnancy you don't want or have a child does not start when the child is born and end when the child is terminated. turned over. It starts from the minute this decision is forced.
Yeah. All right. Good discussion. Thank you both so much for being with us.
Thanks, guys.
We'll have more Rising right after this.